The fire in the drawing room at Ash Vale had burned down to its coals by the time the county of Somerset turned its full attention to Henrietta MacDonald, and by then she had stopped expecting anyone to look. But that was later. That was the night the snow came down in thick, unhurried curtains outside the long windows, and Edmund Ashford, Earl of Ashvale, crossed a ballroom floor in front of 200 witnesses and said her name as though it were the only word worth saying. That was the night the hierarchy reversed itself, slowly and with great ceremony, like a tide that has decided it has gone far enough in one direction. First, there was the morning of her birthday. She woke at 7:30 in the narrow upper room of her stepmother's Bath lodgings and lay still for a moment, listening. The lodgings were on Trim Street, 3 floors above a milliner's shop, and in the mornings one could hear the cart horses on the cobblestones below, and the milliner's girl sweeping the front step with a worn-down broom. Henrietta heard both of these things. She did not hear her stepmother's voice calling from the floor below. She did not hear her 2 stepsisters on the landing, whispering and laughing as they sometimes did when something pleased them. The house was as quiet as it ever was on any unremarkable Tuesday in January. She was 25 years old today. The date was the 4th of January, 1814, and the fact of it sat in her chest like a stone she had been carrying for long enough that she no longer noticed the weight. 25. She rose, dressed herself without the assistance of the one housemaid who served the whole establishment, and came downstairs to find the breakfast table set for 4, the tea already poured, and not one of the 3 women at the table looking up from what engaged them. Her stepmother, Mrs. Lavinia MacDonald, was reading a letter. Her stepsister Charlotte was arranging a ribbon. Her stepsister Priscilla was cutting a slice of bread with the focused attention of someone completing an important task. Henrietta sat down, poured a second cup of tea over the cold dregs already in the cup, and ate her bread without speaking. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. One of the cart horses outside made a sound of objection. The milliner's girl swept on. No one said a word about the date. She had not, she told herself, expected otherwise. Her father had been dead for 2 years, and it was her father who had remembered her birthday with the precision of a man who had made a ceremony of small things. A posy of early flowers left outside her door, a book wrapped in brown paper, her name said at breakfast in a particular tone that meant, "Today is yours." With him gone, the date was simply a date. Her stepmother had never observed it warmly even when he was alive, and Charlotte and Priscilla had their own seasons to manage, their own ribbons to arrange, their own small worlds that did not include her. Henrietta had learned, in 2 years of this quiet, to occupy as little space as possible. She dressed neatly in gowns that were perhaps 2 seasons behind the fashion. She observed through the milliner's window. She spoke when spoken to, and held her opinions in a private register that she visited only when alone. She was, she had concluded, a woman her own household had agreed to forget, and she had nearly agreed herself. The knock came at 10:30. She was in the small sitting room off the entry hall, mending the hem of Charlotte's second-best pelisse, when she heard it. 3 firm, deliberate strokes against the front door, the kind of knock that announces rather than inquires. She heard the housemaid cross the entry hall, heard the door open, heard a man's voice speak her name clearly, in the form of a question. Not Mrs. MacDonald's girl. Not the apothecary. Her name. She set down the pelisse. The man in the entry hall was perhaps 50 years of age, wearing a coat of reasonable quality and carrying a leather satchel that had seen considerable use. He had the manner of a person accustomed to delivering news that altered circumstances, which is to say he delivered it without either pity or ceremony, simply as fact. His name was Silas Prewett. He was, he explained, the solicitor engaged to manage the estate of the late Mr. Alastair MacDonald, Henrietta's father. He had called today because today was the date specified in the original settlement document, the document that governed the disposition of Fern Hill, the 40-acre holding adjacent to the Ashvale estate in Somerset. The settlement named Henrietta as sole heir, entailed specifically to her, contingent on her reaching the age of 25 years. That contingency, Prewett said, placing his satchel on the hall table with measured care, had been met as of this morning. Henrietta stood in the door of the sitting room, holding Charlotte's pelisse, and looked at the solicitor for a moment, before she trusted herself to speak. "My father specified me," she said, "by name." "By name and by age," Prewett confirmed. He withdrew a document from the satchel, a page of close legal script with a red wax seal at the bottom, and placed it on the table. "The settlement was drawn 18 years ago and has never been altered. Fern Hill is yours, Miss MacDonald. The 40 acres, the farmhouse, and the cottage at the north boundary. The Earl of Ashvale holds the surrounding land, and his estate shares the eastern wall. There will be a matter of establishing your presence there. But the title is clear." Behind Henrietta, in the breakfast room, her stepmother's chair scraped. She had heard. They had all heard. Henrietta did not look back. She looked at the document on the table, at her father's hand in the settlement clause that Prewett indicated, at the words specifying her name in firm black ink as though he had written her a letter 2 years after his death to tell her that he had not, in fact, forgotten. That he had arranged, on the morning of her birthday, for someone to knock on the door. She pressed her fingertips flat against the table and kept her face very still. "I will need some days," she said, "to arrange the journey." Prewett told her that a week would be sufficient. He left her his card, replaced the document in its envelope, and closed his satchel with the click of a man who had fulfilled his obligation precisely. He wished her good morning. He left. Henrietta returned to the sitting room, sat down, and looked at the pelisse in her lap for a long moment. Then she folded it, placed it on the chair, and went upstairs to begin packing. She reached Ashvale on a gray Thursday morning, the 9th of January, arriving by hired conveyance along a road that ran between frost-hardened fields, the hedgerows stripped to their black winter bones. She had her father's copy of the settlement in her traveling case, a detail she had thought careful rather than prescient. Fern Hill appeared on the right side of the road first as a low stone farmhouse with a chimney that wanted relighting, the 40 acres behind it running up to a stand of bare elms at the northern edge. The fields were not in use. The cottage at the north boundary had its shutters closed. The farmhouse itself was habitable, if cold, and she spent an hour coaxing the kitchen fire before her traveling bag was properly unpacked. Prewett had arranged for a woman from the village, a Mrs. Garfield, to come in daily. And she arrived that first afternoon with bread and a pot of soup, and the information that the Earl of Ashvale was not presently in residence, having gone north to his Cumberland estate the previous October. "His mother is at the house, though," Mrs. Garfield said, setting the bread on the scrubbed kitchen table. "Lady Ashford. She's been at Ashvale all winter." A brief pause. "She will know you're here." She did. The card arrived the following morning, written in a hand of precise elegance on heavy cream paper. Lady Dorothea Ashford presented her compliments to Miss MacDonald and would be pleased to receive her at Ashvale House at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, should Miss MacDonald find herself with leisure to call. The phrasing of the invitation was impeccable. The warmth in it was as absent as a fire someone had neglected to lay. Henrietta arrived at 3 o'clock on Friday in her second-best dress, which was neat and well-pressed and the color of dark water. Nothing that could be faulted, and nothing that rivaled the drawing-room she was shown into. Ashvale's drawing-room faced the winter garden and was furnished with the accumulated weight of 3 generations of confident spending. Silk-covered chairs in a deep gold, a carpet that had cost more than Fern Hill's annual yield, 2 portraits of Ashford ancestors flanking a fireplace large enough to warm a wing. Beside that fireplace sat Lady Dorothea, upright and composed, with the bearing of a woman who had held her position so long it had become indistinguishable from her spine. Miss Cecily Vane sat at her left hand, arranged with the unconscious precision of someone who has been told her whole life that she is exactly where she should be. She was perhaps 22, fair, dressed in a figured muslin that was the precise height of fashion, and she received Henrietta with the particular smile one gives to a person whose presence in the room requires a private reclassification. "Miss MacDonald," Lady Dorothea said, when the housemaid had withdrawn, "welcome to Somerset. I trust Fern Hill is comfortable, such as it is." Henrietta thanked her and said that she found it quite satisfactory. "Your father was a man of some sentiment," Lady Dorothea continued, pouring tea with the calm of a woman who controlled the rate of all social exchange by controlling the temperature of the liquid she dispensed. "To entail such a modest property to a daughter when he might have made a simpler arrangement. One admires the affection behind it, if not necessarily the practicality." "My father was thorough," Henrietta said, "especially in legal matters." Cecily turned her cup in its saucer. "One hears the property has been unworked for some years," she said pleasantly. "It must be quite a project for a young woman managing alone." 40 acres is not so large a project," Henrietta said. "I expect to have the fields in order before spring." Lady Dorothea set down the teapot. "And in the meantime, you must find the neighborhood quiet after Bath. We are a small county in winter. The assemblies do not begin until February, and the house parties are few." She looked at Henrietta with the measured attention of a woman calculating something precisely. "Still, I shall ensure that you are introduced where it is suitable." Henrietta thanked her again, drank her tea, and returned to Fern Hill before the light failed. She understood, by the time she reached her own kitchen, what she had been told. She was to be introduced where it was suitable. She was a provincial woman of modest means with 40 acres and no family at her back, arrived in the county of a great estate, and the hierarchy had looked at her and sorted her into her proper drawer and closed it. She had been told, in the politest possible terms, that she was not quite the thing. She relit the kitchen fire and did not permit herself to argue with the assessment until she was quite certain it was unfair. The Earl of Ashvale returned on the 16th of January, announced by the sound of horses in the Ashvale courtyard just after dawn, which Henrietta heard from the Fern Hill side of the eastern wall while she was walking the field boundary in the gray morning light. She did not see him that day, nor the next. She heard reports of him through Mrs. Garfield, that he had come back leaner than he left, that he had been seen reviewing the estate accounts until late in the evenings, that he was not in good spirits, though Mrs. Garfield added quickly that he was never precisely in good spirits, and one should not read too much into the matter. Henrietta first encountered him in the Ashvale Library at 6 in the morning on the 20th of January, which was not a place she had any intention of being. She had brought a letter to the house for Lady Dorothea, an oversight in her response to the previous week's correspondence, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Blaine, had let her in through the side entrance and suggested she wait. Henrietta had been directed to the morning room, but she had taken a wrong door in the unfamiliar corridor and found herself instead at the threshold of a large, book-lined room where a fire was already burning, and a man stood at the window with his back to her, reading a letter in the early light. He was tall, with the kind of stillness in the shoulders that comes not from ease, but from long practice of keeping things contained. His coat was plain, as though he had not expected to be observed. His hair was dark and wanted cutting. He turned when he heard her step, and Henrietta understood immediately, from the quality of his attention, that this was not a man who sorted women into drawers without looking first. "Miss MacDonald?" he said. It was not a question. He had been told she was in the county. "I apologize," she said. "I have taken a wrong turn. I was directed to the morning room." "You were directed incorrectly." He folded the letter. "The morning room is 2 doors back." He looked at her for a moment with eyes the color of smoke over frozen ground, weighing something she could not name. "Sit down. Mrs. Blaine will have tea in a quarter of an hour." "I would not trouble you," she said. "You are not troubling me," he said, with the flatness of a man stating a fact. "Sit down, Miss MacDonald." She sat. He returned to his letter briefly, then set it aside on the desk with the deliberate motion of a man closing one thing in order to open another. "How do you find Fern Hill?" he said. It was not quite a question either. "Cold," she said. "The south chimney will need work before next winter. The fields are sound, though. The soil does not appear to have been badly neglected." He looked at her again with that particular quality of attention she could not place. "You have walked the boundary." "3 times," she said. "I wanted to understand what I had." Something in his face shifted then, very slightly, the way light changes when a cloud moves off the sun. He said nothing. The fire cracked. The tea arrived, brought by a young footman who arranged the service with the self-conscious precision of one being watched, and Henrietta poured because it was in front of her, and the alternative was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at nothing. They sat together in the Ashvale Library for 20 minutes, speaking of the south chimney and the eastern field, and the question of a tenant for the Fern Hill cottage, and when she rose to go, Edmund Ashford rose with her, as correct as she could have wished, and offered no comment on the earliness of the hour or the unusualness of the occasion. She walked back to Fern Hill in the cold morning and told herself it had been nothing more than a misplaced corridor and a civil exchange, and believed perhaps half of it. If you are finding yourself drawn into this story, you are welcome to stay. There is more to tell. The library encounter might have remained what she called it, a misplaced corridor, had she not gone back to Ashvale 4 days later to return a book she had borrowed from Mrs. Blaine, and taken the right door this time into the morning room, and found Edmund's young ward seated alone at the table with a Latin grammar open in front of him, and the expression of a boy who has decided that Latin grammar is his personal enemy. His name was Thomas Hartley, 9 years old, the son of Edmund's late friend Captain Hartley, who had died at Victoria the previous summer. Thomas had come to Ashvale in September and had not, by Mrs. Blaine's quiet account, found his footing. He was a quiet child with a watchful face and the careful stillness of someone who has recently lost something large and is trying not to take up too much space while he recalibrates. Henrietta recognized that stillness. She sat down across from him. "What are you working at?" she said. "Irregular verbs," Thomas said with extreme dislike. "Which ones?" He showed her. She looked at the page and thought for a moment, and then began, without asking, to read the passage aloud, very slowly, pausing at the verbs to let the pattern become visible. Thomas did not ask her to do it. He listened. After the second passage, he began reading with her, haltingly at first, then with more confidence, and by the time the third passage was finished, something in his face had eased enough that she could see, beneath it, the kind of intelligent, curious child he was when he was not frightened. She did not know, until she rose to leave 20 minutes later, and happened to glance at the morning room door, that it had been standing slightly open, and that Edmund Ashford was on the other side of it. He was not reading. He was not occupied with anything else. He was standing in the corridor with one hand braced against the doorframe, looking in, and his face held an expression she had never seen on it before. A kind of unguarded attention, the way a man looks when he sees something he did not know he had been waiting to see. He stepped back when he understood she had seen him. He said nothing. She said nothing. She left the book with Mrs. Blaine and walked home in the cold afternoon, and the 40 acres of Fern Hill were very quiet around her. There was a woman in a small portrait in the upstairs corridor at Ashvale, a narrow, gilt-framed thing hung between two windows in a spot that caught neither the morning light nor the afternoon. Henrietta had noticed it only because it faced the wall. The canvas was turned entirely inward, the gilt back of the frame all that was visible, and the effect was strange enough that she had asked Mrs. Blaine about it, casually, the following week. Mrs. Blaine's expression closed briefly, the way a house closes its shutters before a storm. "That was the late Lady Ashford," she said. "His lordship's wife. Lady Clara." Clara had died 2 years ago, in February, of a fever that had lasted 9 days. Edmund had been in Yorkshire when the first message came, reviewing a dispute over drainage rights on the northern estate, a matter he had judged too pressing to leave and too complicated to resolve by letter. He had come as quickly as he could, which was not quickly enough. Clara had died on the 6th day, on a morning when the doctor had believed her improving, and Edmund had arrived on the 7th. He had not moved her portrait until the following spring. No one could say precisely what had prompted him to turn it to the wall, only that one morning it was facing inward, and the household had understood, without being told, that it was not to be touched. Henrietta did not know any of this when she stood in the corridor and looked at the turned frame, but she understood the shape of it. She understood it in the way one understands a wound not by seeing it, but by the careful distance a person keeps from the place where it lives. She left the corridor without lingering, and went back to Fern Hill and relaid her kitchen fire, because the south wind had come up, and the cold was arriving through the stones of the house, and there was nothing she could do about Edmund Ashford's grief except stay out of it. Lady Dorothea's formal dinner was held on the last Friday of January, and Henrietta was invited because to leave her out would have been a social error in a county small enough to notice such things. She arrived to find 12 persons already assembled in the Ashvale drawing room, and the seating arranged so that she was placed at the far end of the table, between the vicar's wife, a gentlewoman named Mrs. Pethwick, and a red-faced magistrate named Sir George Trent, who was interested chiefly in his own hunting. Cecily was seated at Edmund's right hand. Lady Dorothea presided from the opposite end of the table with the composure of a woman who has arranged every variable in the room to her satisfaction. The dinner was long, and the conversation was careful, and Henrietta ate her soup and her fish and her ragout, and spoke pleasantly to Mrs. Pethwick about the village school, in which they both had an interest, and watched the table without appearing to watch it. It was at the remove of the second course that Lady Dorothea spoke across the table to Edmund about the question of Miss Vane's prospects in Somerset, whether the county offered sufficient society for a young woman of her distinction, whether a longer stay at Ashvale might remedy the season's shortage of suitable occasions. The phrasing was so transparent that Mrs. Pethwick pressed her lips together. Edmund, Henrietta noticed, did not respond to his mother with the ease of a man who had agreed in advance to the proposition. He said something quiet and non-committal about the season's calendar. Lady Dorothea received it without visible disappointment and moved to the next subject. But as the table rose for the withdrawal, Cecily passed close to Henrietta and said in a voice pitched low enough for courtesy and high enough for Henrietta to hear plainly, "How long do you intend to remain in Somerset, Miss MacDonald? Fern Hill is very modest for a whole winter." "I find it suits me well enough," Henrietta said. Cecily's smile held. "You are very adaptable," she said, "given your circumstances." Henrietta did not answer. She went into the drawing room with the other women and sat near the fire and held her cup of tea and kept her face very still. Lady Dorothea was at the embroidery frame by the window. She looked up once, across the room, and Henrietta understood with precise clarity that this dinner had been an observation, not an invitation, and that the assessment made of her tonight would not be a kind one. The letter arrived on the 4th of February, delivered by a Ashvale footman on a gray afternoon. It was from Lady Dorothea's solicitor, not Prewett, and it stated, in language of juridical formality, that new evidence had come to light regarding the Fern Hill settlement. Specifically, a deed of conveyance, dated the previous October, in which Alastair MacDonald had signed Fern Hill back to the Ashvale estate in settlement of a debt of record. The deed was enclosed as a copy. The matter, the letter suggested, might require reconsideration of Miss MacDonald's occupancy. Henrietta read the letter twice. She sat with it in the cold light of the Fern Hill kitchen for long enough to feel, in the floor of her chest, the particular weight of a door being closed. Then she got up, went to her traveling case, and withdrew the original settlement document that Prewett had given her on her birthday. She placed it beside the copy of the alleged deed on the kitchen table and looked at both. Her father's handwriting was in the settlement. She knew that handwriting. She had his letters, had been reading it for 24 years. The deed that Lady Dorothea's solicitor had sent bore a signature that approximated it well enough to confuse someone who was not familiar with the original hand, but her father's capital letters were distinctive in 3 particulars: the loop of the A, the crossing of the D, and the way the terminal L in MacDonald rose to a slight point rather than curling flat. The signature on the deed had none of these. She sat with this knowledge for one day. She wrote to Prewett that evening and received his reply by the afternoon post of the following day. He had seen the deed, had been presented with it by Lady Dorothea's man, and had already identified the discrepancies she had observed. The original settlement, held in his office, predated and superseded any conveyance not co-signed by Prewett himself as the estate's appointed solicitor, which this deed was not. The title to Fern Hill was not in question. He would attend at Ashvale the following week to confirm this in person. Henrietta folded both letters carefully. She placed the original settlement back in its envelope. She put on her coat and walked the boundary of Fern Hill in the cold afternoon. All 40 acres of it, the bare elms at the north and the stone wall at the east and the frost-hardened south field, and she said nothing at all to anyone until the following Thursday. The occasion that Lady Dorothea had chosen for the presentation of the forged deed was Ashvale's February assembly, held in the ballroom for the benefit of the county. It was the largest room in the house, hung with candelabras that multiplied the light until the room seemed to generate its own small weather. And by 8 o'clock it held perhaps 160 persons, the Somerset gentry arranged in their customary patterns of hierarchy, proximity, and careful social distance. Henrietta arrived with Mrs. Pethwick, who had offered the carriage and the escort, with such genuine warmth that Henrietta had not had the heart to refuse. She was in her best gown, which was a deep blue silk her father had given her 3 birthdays ago, well made and simply cut. Not quite equal to the occasion, but not unequal either. She entered the room and took the temperature of it in one careful survey, and understood that something had already been arranged. Lady Dorothea was at the far end of the room near the tall windows, and with her was Cecily, and between them stood Edmund, in the formal black of a man who was dressed for the occasion because duty required it, rather than because he wished to be present. At their side stood a man Henrietta did not recognize, Lady Dorothea's solicitor, holding a document. Privet was across the room, near the entry, and his face was carefully neutral. The assembly had barely reached the end of its first set when Lady Dorothea moved. She did not raise her voice. She did not require a raised voice. She requested, in tones of perfect social authority, that Miss MacDonald approach, as there was a matter of public record regarding the Fern Hill property that the county ought to be aware of. 200 persons in a ballroom can hear a request made in tones of perfect social authority. The music continued, but the attention in the room had shifted, and Henrietta felt it as a physical thing, the way one feels a change in air pressure. She walked across the floor. "Miss MacDonald," Lady Dorothea said, and there was a satisfaction in the way she said it that she had not quite managed to suppress. "I am afraid a difficulty has emerged concerning your tenancy of Fern Hill. My solicitor, Mr. Brixton, has produced a deed of conveyance signed by your late father, ceding the property to the Ashvale estate. It appears your claim rests on a settlement that was subsequently altered." Beside her, Edmund had gone very still. His face was stone. He did not look at Cecily. He looked at Henrietta. "I am familiar with the document Mr. Brixton has produced," Henrietta said. Her voice was level. "I examined it on its arrival at Fern Hill. I also examined my father's original settlement, which Mr. Privet holds and has held since it was first drawn, 18 years ago." She turned slightly toward Privet, who was now standing at her left side. "Mr. Privet." Privet stepped forward, opened his case, and placed the original settlement on the small table beside Lady Dorothea. "The document before you is the original settlement of Fern Hill to Miss Henrietta MacDonald, drawn in 1796 and never altered," he said. "The deed of conveyance presented by Mr. Brixton bears a signature that does not correspond to Mr. MacDonald's attested hand and lacks the co-signature of the estate's appointed solicitor, which the settlement's own terms require for any subsequent conveyance to be valid. The Fern Hill title is unencumbered. Miss MacDonald's occupancy is lawful." He said it plainly, without inflection, the way a man states a fact he has confirmed on multiple grounds. The room held a very particular silence. Lady Dorothea looked at the original settlement. Something moved across her face. Swiftly, a recognition of the precise point at which confidence has outrun what the ground can support. And then it was gone, and her face was composed again. But it was not the same composure. It was the composure of someone who has had to construct it quickly from available materials. Mr. Brixton said nothing. Cecily's hand closed around the edge of her fan and did not open again. Then Edmund moved. He crossed the ballroom in 3 unhurried strides, which, in the silence that had fallen, were the loudest thing in the room. He came to stand beside Henrietta, not behind her, not at a formal social distance, but at her side. Close enough that she could see the set of his jaw and the particular quality of stillness that had nothing to do with indifference, and everything to do with the decision he had already made. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at Cecily. He looked at Henrietta. And then he looked out at the room, at the 160 faces of Somerset, the magistrate, and the vicar, and Mrs. Pethwick, and the young ladies with their partners, and the old men with their brandy, and he said, in the level voice he used for facts that did not require ornamentation, "Miss MacDonald is my neighbor, and the owner of Fern Hill in full legal title, and it is my intention, if she will have me, to alter both those conditions into something more permanent." The silence stretched for one long-held breath. Henrietta looked at him. He was watching her with those smoke-gray eyes, and the expression that was not cold at all, had never been cold, had always been something else entirely. something she had been misreading through the particular lens of a woman who expects to be forgotten. She saw it clearly now. "You had no practical reason," she said quietly, so that only he could hear. "To ask about the south chimney." "No," he said. "I did not." "Or to remember that I had walked the boundary 3 times." "No," he said again, and something in his face shifted toward the expression she had seen through the half-open morning room door, that unguarded attending. "I have found it difficult to forget a great many things about you, Miss MacDonald. I would rather you considered the prospect of my not trying." She looked at him for a long moment in the candlelit ballroom, with the county of Somerset watching, and the fire of the candelabras multiplying around them, and the sound of the winter wind at the tall windows. "Henrietta," she said, "if we are to be permanent neighbors." His mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. And it was the most significant thing his face had done in her presence. "Henrietta," he said, and her name in his voice was a different thing entirely from the way anyone else had said it in years. Lady Dorothea did not withdraw from the room. That would have been a gesture too large for a woman of her composure, and she was too skilled for large gestures when small ones served. She closed her fan, inclined her head a precise and dignified fraction, and turned to speak to Sir George Trent about the January hunting, and the county of Somerset, taking its cue from her movement rather than her expression, allowed the assembly to resume as though the last 4 minutes had been a brief pause in the evening's entertainment. Cecily was escorted from the room 20 minutes later by an aunt with every appearance of calm, and the county would say afterward that she had been very gracious about it, which was the kindest possible thing to say, and said very little about her actual feelings on the matter. Priwet departed before the second set of dancing began, his case closed, his function completed. He offered Henrietta a brief, respectful nod as he passed, and she nodded in return, and that was the end of the solicitor, who had knocked on her door on her birthday and given her father's voice back to her. Mrs. Pethwick found her during the interval, took both her hands, and said nothing for a moment, only held them with a warmth that required no gloss. Edmund did not dance that evening. He stood beside Henrietta through the second set and the third, speaking with the county's various members with his customary brevity. And when the carriages were called at 11, he walked her to Mrs. Pethwick's conveyance and said, before she stepped up, "I will call at Fern Hill tomorrow, if I may." "The south chimney is still in need of attention," she said. "It is," he said. "I have already spoken to the mason." She looked at him. "Before tonight." "Before tonight," he confirmed. She climbed into the carriage and sat across from Mrs. Pethwick as the horses moved off down the Ashvale Drive, and she pressed her fingertips against the cold window glass and felt, beneath the bone, the precise sensation of a door swinging open instead of closed. He called the following morning, as promised, and the morning after that. And by the end of the second week of February, it was understood in the village and at the great house and along the road between Fern Hill and Ashvale that the Earl was calling on Miss MacDonald with an attention that was neither casual nor deniable. He brought Thomas twice, who came in and went directly to Henrietta without preamble, and resumed, without a word of preamble, the irregular verbs, as though the morning room at Ashvale had been simply relocated to Fern Hill's kitchen table. Henrietta watched Thomas's face ease, degree by degree, across those sessions, the careful stillness yielding ground to something more like presence. She understood that Edmund watched it too, from across the table or from the kitchen door, with his tea going cold in his hand, and that what he was watching cost him something, and gave him something in equal measure. He made her the offer on a Wednesday in the third week of February in the Fern Hill sitting room, standing near the fire with his hands very still at his sides. He had been told that he was not a man who did things by halves, and that he was not a man who said things he did not mean. And both of these things were visible in the directness with which he looked at her, and the economy with which he said it. That he had not expected to find anyone in the county who walked their boundary 3 times in the winter dark to understand what they possessed, and that he hoped she would consider extending that care to a larger property and a more complicated household. She told him that she required 1 day to consider. She walked the full boundary of Fern Hill that afternoon, alone, in the cold light that came off the elms at the north end, and she thought about her father's hand in the settlement document and the particular form of the capital A, and about Thomas at the kitchen table, and about Edmund's face in the half-open doorway of the morning room, unguarded and attending. She thought about the narrow room in Bath, and the table set for 4, and the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, while no one said a word about the date. She went in from the cold, and wrote Edmund a letter, and sent it with Mrs. Garfield's boy before supper. He came to Fern Hill the next morning at 8 o'clock, which was an hour too early for a formal call, and the exact hour she had specified in the letter. And she opened the door herself, and he came in out of the cold, and they stood in the Fern Hill sitting room, with the fire going, and the snow beginning outside the window, the first snow of the winter, falling in the particular unhurried way of snow that intends to settle. She had one condition, she told him. She wanted to keep Fern Hill, not as a separate estate, not as a legal arrangement between neighbors, but as a place she had come to on her birthday because her father had remembered her, and she did not want to lose that. He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw, at the edge of his expression, the thing she had seen in the upstairs corridor when she had asked about the turned portrait. A kind of acknowledgement, a careful setting down of something heavy. "It is yours," he said, "as it has always been yours." She had thought she was prepared for the directness of him. She found she was not, quite. The banns were read in March, and on the afternoon before the wedding, Lady Dorothea called at Fern Hill, alone, without Cecily, who had by then returned to her family in Wiltshire. She sat in the Fern Hill sitting room in her best visiting dress, and she said, with the particular precision of a woman who has learned to be accurate even when accuracy is costly, that she had misjudged the situation and was prepared to say so plainly. She did not say it warmly, but she said it. Henrietta thanked her and poured the tea herself, and they sat together for half an hour and spoke of the Ashvale household and Thomas's Latin and the question of the spring planting at Fern Hill. And when Lady Dorothea left, she was upright and composed and reduced in a way that had nothing to do with humiliation and everything to do with correction, the kind that a person of real intelligence can absorb and eventually live inside. The wedding was quiet, in the village church, with Mrs. Pethwick and Prewett and Thomas and a handful of Edmund's nearest neighbors. Thomas held the ring. He was very serious about it. Spring came, and then summer, and the Fern Hill fields came back into use under a tenant Edmund had engaged from the village, a steady man named Cooper who knew the Somerset soil and asked sensible questions about the drainage at the eastern edge. The 40 acres produced well enough that first season to confirm what Henrietta had thought when she first walked the boundary. The land had not been badly neglected. It had only been forgotten. The portrait of Lady Clara was moved, sometime in the early autumn, from the upstairs corridor where it had faced the wall. It went to Edmund's private study, placed on the shelf above the window where the morning light caught it, facing out. Henrietta noticed the change on a Tuesday and said nothing about it, and Edmund said nothing about it, and the household understood it as they had understood the original turning. Silently, as the resolution of something that had needed time and had now had enough. By November, Thomas had stopped being careful about taking up space. He was at the Fern Hill kitchen table on the afternoon that the first snow came properly, the heavy settling kind, pressing his face against the cold glass to watch it accumulate on the Fern Hill fields, his breath fogging the pane in small, warm clouds. Henrietta was at the table with the household accounts, and Edmund was reading by the fire, and the kitchen smelled of the soup that Mrs. Garfield had left on the range. "Will it cover the elms?" Thomas asked, his voice muffled by the glass. "If it keeps on," Henrietta said. She looked up from the accounts at Edmund, and he looked up from his book at the same moment, and between them was the kitchen table and the soup on the range, and Thomas's handprint in the fog on the glass, and the small warm lamp that burned on the sill, visible from the lane. There was a candle in that window every evening, as long as she lived there. It was the first thing she had put in the house, the morning she arrived, on a gray January day that was also her birthday, when no one else had thought to mark the date. If this story moved you, leave a word in the comments. The telling of it was worthwhile